Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. People can argue over whether Jim Brown was the greatest running back in the history of the National Football League. Perhaps he was. He's got my vote. But no one can deny that he was one of the very greatest players ever to step onto a field. He was also one of the greatest lacrosse players ever, a Hall of Famer in that sport as well. As with most legendary figures, the reality behind the legend is complicated. So we are going to devote 2 programs to an exploration of the life and legacy of Jim Brown. Our guide through both programs is the great Dave Zirin, sports editor of The Nation magazine, host of the wonderful Edge of Sports podcast, and author of the definitive biography of Brown called Jim Brown, Last Man Standing. Dave, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a thrill to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So I barely touched on the extraordinary athletic talents of Jim Brown, and we're going to talk about his prowess across a range of sports during the course of these 2 programs. But just give us a sense as a way of setting the stage of just how great a football player he was.
Absolutely, and it's such a good first question because while Jim Brown may have led half a dozen different lives in half a dozen different fields, the starting point is really athletics. I mean, and this is about our society. Like, why was Jim Brown listened to in the first place, whether it was Hollywood or in gang truces or in the Black Power movement? It was because of the way he was seen on the athletic field. And let me just say that Jim Brown was the first modern athletic superstar. That's very important for us to get our heads around. He was the first athlete to ever use an agent. He was the first athlete to ever get a coach fired because he disagreed with the direction of the club. And that coach was the legendary Paul Brown, who the Cleveland Browns, Jim Brown's team, was named after. He was the first athlete to ever walk into a GM's office and say, "You just released friends of mine. I insist that you rehire them immediately." And then they did it. So
Incredible.
why did Jim Brown, in a period when Dr. Martin Luther King was just emerging from Boston University and heading down to Alabama, why was Jim Brown so heard at this time in U.S. history? It has everything to do with that athletic prowess that he brought to the table. And I would argue that Jim Brown is the greatest athlete in the history of the United States.
Wow.
And I can back that claim up. I mean, you mentioned it, Bob. He's the greatest player ever, or at least in the argument as greatest player ever in 2 different sports. Of course, football and lacrosse. But in addition to that, he tried out for an NCAA decathlon without training, and came in 5th. He was offered a letter, even though he never played baseball, he was offered a letter by Casey Stengel of the New York Yankees begging him to try out for the team. He was offered a formal contract to fight for the heavyweight boxing championship. He had never boxed. I mean, I found an old report from the black press from the early 1960s, just a story about Jim Brown walking onto a cricket pitch and within minutes being the best cricket player out there in a field of people who've been playing the sport their whole lives. I mean, this is who Jim Brown was. As a combination of body and mind, he was the best ever. Now, I did interview with Jim Brown towards the end of his life, and he insisted that the best athlete ever was Jim Thorpe. And he insisted that the best team athlete ever was his good friend, Bill Russell. But for my money, you look at Jim Brown and what he was able to do on a field, and there's nobody close.
He was born on St. Simon's Island off the coast of Georgia. It's part of that historic Gullah region back in 1936. And I learned from your book that he had a really kind of a troubled relationship with his parents. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
No, absolutely. I mean, the way to understand Jim Brown is the way to understand St. Simon's Island. In the book, I say it's the way you understand Citizen Kane is you have to know that Rosebud was a sled. And it's similar with Jim Brown is you have to understand St. Simon Island. I mean, he was born to a father named Swinton Brown who left pretty much immediately. And to a mother named Teresa Brown who left St. Simon when he was born to become a domestic worker in Long Island, New York. And she didn't send for Brown until he was 7 or 8 years old. And in those first 7 or 8 years, he had the acute feeling of being abandoned by his mother and his father, but he was also raised by a community of women, which is very interesting.
Right.
There were no men. It was his grandmother, it was his aunt, and his great grandmother is the only person he ever called mother. He wouldn't call his own mother mother. But in the family, he had a different sense of who his mother was. And, he was so himself from the time he was born that this community of women that raised him, they referred to him as man. That was his nickname, even as a small child, was man. And he grew up in a setting that I think has a lot of breadcrumbs for who the person he became politically. Because St. Simon was not just a black community, but it was a black community that had largely, for many, many years, been left alone by white America because of the marshy nature of the land, which is why so many of those Gullah traditions that come from Africa were able to maintain themselves in the region. And northern educators would travel down to St. Simon Island after the Civil War and interview people about African traditions because so many of them had been maintained to St. Simon's. Now, this was rapidly changing as Jim Brown was growing up, and St. Simon was turning into what it is today, which is a series of golf courses. Wow. and luxury country clubs. But back then, it was marshland and it was black controlled. And that changed. But Jim Brown, that sense of black self-sufficiency that could happen inside the United States became a core part of his politics.
So his mother sends for him and he has to go from that area that you're describing to Long Island, which must have been a culture shock. Talk about what it was like for him and especially tell us about the two mentors that he encountered when he was in Long Island.
Absolutely. I mean, and I want to have your listeners really put themselves in Jim Brown's shoes, because that's to me an important part of this, is a sense of understanding that you have this young kid growing up in St. Simon's Island in this community of women in an entirely black space. And then he's moved to suburban Long Island, where he's one of the few black people at his entire school. And it's a wealthy school. And it's a white school, and it's a suburban school.
Nothing like what he's experienced so far.
No, I mean, he'd never experienced school, period. And all of a sudden, he's thrust into what is an almost entirely white space that also is a white space of tremendous wealth. This is because his mother worked as a domestic worker and lived in the house of the wealthy family for which she cleaned. Now, in the school itself, Jim Brown found himself very embraced, and this is another part of the story. It was in the Great Neck, Manhasset region. It was considered very liberal at the time, and there was a true embrace of Jim Brown, not the least of which because he was an unbelievable athlete.
Right.
I mean, and that's where he learned lacrosse too, which, as folks listening may know, is the sport in suburban Long Island, and certainly was back then. So he learned lacrosse and excelled in that. And as a football player, he averaged 15 yards a carry. Now,
for those who don't know it, that's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. That's what a really good receiver catches, 15 yards a carry. He's running 15 yards a carry. So, even as a black teenager in the Long Island of the 1950s, he was inundated with college scholarship offers. He was considered such a prodigy. And he had two men in his corner who you mentioned. The first was Coach Walsh, and then there was a judge, Kenneth Malloy. Now, Coach Walsh, another person who I think is important for us to understand in terms of the person Jim Brown became. Coach Walsh was not some sort of Bill Belichick disciplinarian, four-star general type coach. He was kind of a physically small man who was very much like the father figure, the person who talked to their players, put their arm around the players, like really encompassed Jim Brown in a sense of warmth and paternal warmth. And then this judge, Kenneth Malloy, another person who treated Jim Brown like a son. Kenneth Malloy was also a graduate, and a very esteemed graduate of Syracuse University. And Judge Malloy got it in his head that Jim Brown, his guy, Jim Brown, the son from another mother, was going to go to his school of Syracuse.
Right.
There was only one problem. That's the coach of Syracuse, a man named Ben Schwartzwalder, did not want another black player on his team. Jim Brown would have been the second. It was thought by Ben Schwartzwalder that the first player, a man named Avedis Stone, was a disaster. Why was he a disaster? Because he wore flashy clothes and dated white co-eds. And that was enough for Coach Schwartzwalder to say, I don't want another black player on the team. And I know this is a long story, but this part is really
it's important.
Is it okay that I'm going on?
Absolutely.
This part is important just for knowing who he was. And so he's 18. Jim Brown is 17 years old. And if you had asked him at the time, have you ever experienced racism? He would probably say no. He would say, I've actually had a blessed existence, or I've been treated like a human being, not like a young black kid who's out of place in this wealthy white community. And sure enough, though, he goes to Syracuse, and he shows up there with the coach not wanting him on the team. The coach so didn't want him on the team that he did not offer Jim Brown a scholarship to play football. So Jim Brown was told, you have a scholarship to play ball at Syracuse, when Judge Malloy was surreptitiously behind the scenes raising money for his tuition. And so Jim Brown showed up thinking he had a scholarship, but then, which Ben Schwartzwalder said to Judge Malloy, he was a big enough alum that they had these direct discussions, said, I'll let him on the team, but no scholarships.
Wow.
Jim Brown didn't know that. So he shows up, and all of a sudden, he's being told he can't eat with the team in the cafeteria. And he's not staying with the team in the dorms. And he's treated like garbage on the team for the color of his skin. And this is the first time in his life where he felt, wow, my athletic ability, my skills are not going to protect me from racism.
How did he react to that?
With a great deal of anger and resentment towards Coach Ben Schwartzwalder. And even from those early days, he never hesitated getting in the coach's face and telling him that the way he was running this program was ridiculous. Because his athletic talent, I have to be clear about this, it was like he came from the future. He was 6'2", 6'3", 240 pounds. He was the fastest person on the team. He was already starring in lacrosse. He was already somewhat of a campus folk hero, and yet he couldn't get on the football field, and he was a non-scholarship player. So you have the fans chanting, these young kids chanting, touchdown Jimmy Brown, or we want Brown. And it became a situation of campus-wide peer pressure to get him on the field. So one of the coaches actually suggested to Jim Brown that he learn how to punt so he could get on the field more. And Jim Brown, I'm serious, I interviewed him, he was 78 years old. He still looked at me and said, can you believe they wanted me to learn how to punt?
Now, you mentioned in the book that he had threatened to quit a number of times. How did that unfold?
Well, he threatened to leave the team as a basic show of the assertion of his own manhood. And this is the first time you see this in his words and in his actions. Now, where this comes from, I think it comes straight from St. Simon Island. But he held this fierce idea that the assertion of his manhood is the most important thing a person can do, particularly in a racist society where black men, at the time certainly, were regularly derided and classified as boys.
But he didn't quit, though.
And he didn't quit, no. He stayed on because Judge Malloy not only begged him to stay, but also put on him a lot of pressure about being that second black player to matriculate at Syracuse. And, you know, Judge Malloy had a great sense coming from this liberal community in Long Island in the mid-50s that we were living in changing times. And he hated the thought of Syracuse being a step behind that or being branded as a racist institution. So he pressed Jim Brown to be that kind of trailblazer. And later, you know, Malloy said, and I found this in an old book about Jim Brown, about his tortured regret that he had of, as he put it, taking Jim Brown and putting his head in the mouth of a lion. That's how he described it.
You said that, and I think it was Malloy, actually said to him that if he stayed, he could be a credit to his race, which
Yes.
really was like when I read that, it was like a punch in the gut because I hadn't heard that before. How did Brown react to what Malloy had done? One, he hadn't been straight with him about the scholarship. And two, Malloy and Walsh more or less insisting that he stick it out in this hateful situation up at Syracuse.
Very hateful situation. Also, a time when you couldn't leave from school to school the way you can today. He would have had to leave and take a full year off to matriculate somewhere else during a time where, even the schools that were the most liberally minded as far as black athletes had quotas. So it was a very, very unsure situation that he was in. And given the reputation that he was garnering both in the community and on the lacrosse field, and let's remember, lacrosse was Jim Brown's favorite sport, and there is no lacrosse school like Syracuse. It wasn't just about playing at Syracuse, it was about going to the Native American reservation nearby and playing these incredible games with people on the res. So he had a place there that he was developing for himself where football, the thing that he was most talented at, was the biggest gap in terms of being able to matriculate and have the kind of education and experience that he certainly deserved to have. And that idea of being a credit to your race, I think that's also something that had a great impact on Brown politically. Because that phrase, which is often sometimes interpreted through the black press as being a quote unquote race man, is something that Jim Brown, and obviously meaning something very different when it comes from the black press about being a race man.
Right.
That was something that Jim Brown took very, very close to heart. Like this idea of one of the ways that you challenge entrenched systemic racism and white supremacy is you stand up tall and don't let people classify you as being something less than a man. That's why he insisted, and no one argued with him, that everybody on the road for the Cleveland Browns wore shirts and ties, for example. I mean, that was a Jim Brown thing, and it was about, we are going to be treated as equals when we start behaving as equals. Like that part of that credit to your race politics, I think really did find a home in his head.
So he was not insulted by a white person saying to him, you could be a credit to your race.
No, particularly not that white person. Believe me, in his mind, Judge Malloy and Coach Walsh could do no wrong.
And see, and I grew up during that era. My reaction would have been different. I would have been insulted.
In the book, I have the actual letter that Judge Malloy sent to other people in the Long Island community about raising money for Jim Brown's tuition. And the idea that all of this was happening without Brown's knowledge, without his mother's knowledge, I mean, that would be something. It's that he did not find it to be problematic. Right. I mean, it says something about his bonds to these two men. And frankly, I think it also says something about how starved he was for that kind of paternal love.
Right.
In that period in his life. Like I tried raising with him very gently, like, are you sure that, this isn't like a problematic point in your life, like raising the money for your tuition and not telling you what it was for? And he wouldn't hear a word against it.
He did have support on the lacrosse team and from his lacrosse coach. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The Simmons, father and son, Roy Simmons Jr. and Sr. are kind of legendary names up in Syracuse. One the coach, the other a great player. And the coach was somebody who was much more of like Coach Walsh than Coach Schwartzwalder.
Right.
In that he was somebody who brought Jim Brown in. That's all Jim Brown seemed to want, was some sense of community and family at this point in his life on a team. And it's interesting that by the time he becomes a professional, he becomes very disavowed of that and much more much more of a harsh eye on the realities of certainly the power relationships between player and coach or player and management. Right. But at this time in his life in college, coming out of this very sort of cosseted community in Long Island, had him feeling a warmth in the lacrosse world that he just was not getting in the football world. And he certainly wasn't getting either in the basketball world, another sport he excelled at, by the way, one we didn't mention, where he quit the team precisely because of the quotas that they had on the amount of playing time black players would receive.
I remember that they had quotas even in baseball. You could only have so many black players on the field at the same time in baseball, and even in the mid to late 1950s.
Oh
But
yeah.
he was clearly the best player, no question about it, on on the Syracuse football team, and yet he's still largely riding the bench. How did he finally break through that, and when did that happen? How did he become a regular starter?
Well, it really happened towards the end of his sophomore year, where to a confluence of events, he was able to just see the ball on the field. And when he would get the ball, he would tend to score in highly dynamic and I mean, the thing about Jim Brown people have to understand is that he was stronger than you and he was faster than you. And that combination is very rare in the history of sports. You think of people like Bo Jackson
Right.
or LeBron James, like not only bigger than you, or I should say a younger LeBron James,
Right.
not only bigger than you, but faster than you. And so Jim Brown was able to show immediately that he had those kinds of skills. So it was much tougher to keep him off the field than as a junior. The idea of having him punt was gone. Schwartzwalder was against him every step of the way, but the amount of pressure from alums and students to see this incredible, almost like he had almost a Paul Bunyan reputation before he actually took the field at Syracuse. 2 years of everybody saying, because, I mean, imagine being one of the only black students on campus, and also, as his good friend John Wooten once said, being cut like a Greek god.
Right.
And like God, like as Wooten said, God did it only once and then said, I did it perfectly. I'm going to stop. And so you've got this guy walking around campus. He's excelling in school. And so the pressure was just too much. And so he does get on the field, which actually did lay the groundwork for Syracuse being able to recruit Ernie Davis, who became what, frankly, Jim Brown should have been, which is the first Black Heisman Trophy Award winner
Right.
as the best college player in the country, and Syracuse won a national championship. So all of that, Jim Brown played a role in laying the groundwork for, even if he couldn't taste the fruits of those success.
Talk a little bit about how triumphant Brown's junior and senior seasons were at Syracuse in terms of his football performance.
Sure. I mean, he set records for number of points in a game. He kicked field goals. He scored touchdowns. Some of the records that he held, individual game records, have lasted through the decades. It's really a tale of dominance during the last year and a half of his college career. And his senior year is really something because he had by far the best stats in the country for a team that did really well. And yet he didn't come in the top, I believe it was the top 4 in the Heisman Trophy voting, including players selected ahead of him who had markedly inferior statistics. And it really says something very symbolic that the winner that year of the Heisman Trophy for a Notre Dame team that had more losses than wins was Paul Hornung, whose nickname was the Golden Boy.
A losing season as quarterback for Notre Dame.
Yes.
And he wins the Heisman Trophy.
Over Jim Brown, who had a terrific Syracuse team and over 900 yards rushing and could not be stopped. And had 4 yards and had better statistics than everybody in front of him. And it was so blatant that Dick Schaap, the great sports writer who was a Heisman Trophy voter, not only refused to ever vote for the Heisman Trophy again, but actually held his vote and sent it in blank every year for decades.
Wow.
Out of protest from this very season where Jim Brown did not win. But that was the reality of the intersection of sports and white supremacy.
Well, speaking of that, Ben Schwartzwalder, the coach at Syracuse, who it turns out really was, in my view, an awful racist, he was forced to retire in 1973. What happened there?
I mean, Ben Schwartzwalder, yeah, whose name, by the way, means Black Forest.
Right.
Like his black players would enter the Black Forest and not come out the other end.
Right.
He was somebody who, in the early 70s and late 60s, started to be protested by his own players, by black athletes on the team. And he would make these regular promises to them about hiring black assistant coaches or even having black cheerleaders, and then not do them. And eventually they became known as the Syracuse Nine. And he agreed to their demands and then kicked them all off the team.
Wow. So in the end, race was his undoing. So he was forced to
Yes.
resign. So we've run out of time, but I just want to mention that Brown, following his senior year at Syracuse, was selected 6th overall in the National Football League draft by the Cleveland Browns. And in part 2, we're going to pick up Jim Brown's story there. We're going to talk about his NFL career and then the extraordinary post-career career that Jim Brown had. Dave Zirin, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.